Hello, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that nice, relaxing music as an intro. And it's still playing. Sorry about that. Okay, there it goes. Anyway, hi, I am CheeseSlice. I am I am the engineer and producer for today's show on Pasta to Go. This is Left on Left with host Gloria Guillo and resident expert Jayme Kuzmarov. They are going to be recording two segments that are going to be aired on WBAI radio. And we are going to be recording them live. We have a special guest today to talk about Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion. And let's go ahead and get started because we're on the clock. Here's our host, Gloria. Hello, Gloria. And
Hey, Jayme. Thank you.
And our guest, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. They're going to be interviewed by Gloria and Jayme today. So let's get started. Gloria, take it away.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, a former administrator in New York City government, an investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left, it's right on. I'm joined here today by our resident expert, Jayme Kuzmarov. Jayme is a professor at Tulsa Community College, a historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of Covert Action Magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme, CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. Our topic is today a two-part series uncovering the truth about the CIA's jihadist holy war in Afghanistan. Jayme and I are joined here today by Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. They were the first American journalists to cover Afghanistan after the 1979 Soviet invasion. At the time, they were operating on the ground as a freelance TV crew for CBS News. Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould are authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, published by City Lights in 2009, Crossing Zero, The AFAC of War, The Turning Point of American Empire, published by City Lights in 2011. Their novel, The Voice, was published in 2001. Their memoir, Valedicti, I hope you'll correct me, October 29th, 2001, on the Three Nights of Desmond, and the Valediction, Resurrection, 2022, was published by Trine Day. Jayme had interviewed Paul and Elizabeth for an article he wrote in Covert Action Magazine that was published on October 29th, 2021. It's titled 1979 Assassination of U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, Adolph Dubs, set groundwork for America's longest war. Now, I've seen photos of Afghanistan from the 70s, and women attending universities wore clothing that matched the times and were similarly found on Western campuses. There seemed no sign of the fundamentalist restrictions we see today. Before we dive into some heady, double-dealing Brzezinski and CIA-led geopolitics, please describe what life was like for the people of Afghanistan back then. All I can remember is that hippies from New York City like to go there to smoke hash. Thank you.
Yeah, Afghanistan was considered to be the Paris of Central Asia. It was a beautiful place. It had very progressive governments that had been moving towards modernization and getting out of the backwards feudal relationship that they had with their leadership. There was a lot of fundamental issues at stake, and it had kind of survived the Cold War. It was propped between the British Empire and the Soviet Empire, and prior to that, it was the Tsarist Empire. So they managed to work out they were very clever diplomatically. They were certainly experts at survival, and they had managed to do that. And that was something we picked up on in the late 1970s. And so the fact is that the American government at that particular time and the political system after Vietnam was ravaged by what had happened in Vietnam, And so they were open to another way. The CIA, the institution was open to another way of going at these issues, and they weren't particularly sensitive to the advancements and the liberalization of things that were happening in Afghanistan. So that's when Zbigniew Brzezinski gets involved in the National Security Council in the Carter administration.
Well, I would like to just quickly add that it's usually very shocking for people to realize that Afghan women were given the right to vote in 1923, and even more importantly, they didn't have to ask for the right. So the very ideas of Afghanistan started out at such a level of complete, of just totally fiction. And today we all know that most people have no idea that preceding the Soviet invasion in 1979, there were no suicide bombers. There was no extremism. These were unknown circumstances that befell the Afghan people when they got drawn into Zbigniew Brzezinski's trap for the Soviet Union.
Great. And yeah, I think we'll have you guys go into that and Brzezinski's policy more. Maybe just first, let the viewers know a bit more about your background and how you became experts in Afghanistan and the kind of education you received about the U.S. media during your time in the country.
Well, that goes back to this would have been before the election of Jimmy Carter. We had been working on the détente movement. We had begun a documentary. We were interviewing people like John Galbraith and Paul Warnke, and the détente was the movement towards resolution, peaceful discussions and resolutions with the Soviet Union to move away from the competition being basically military, and rather than pulling it more into an economic focus. And this was a movement that really got Jimmy Carter elected president. There was a strong desire for it. People were seeing the impact that the Vietnam War had on the American economy. The reinvestment was critically necessary. That's what John Galbraith spent most of his time talking about in his interview. And what was really shocking was on December, after our documentary came out, shortly after, December 27th, 1979, the Soviet Union crosses the border into Afghanistan with 75,000 troops. Definitely got everyone's attention. But what President Carter said about it did kind of shock us. He said this was the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. And it just struck us that seems a little bit oversized for what just happened. This is a neighboring country. The Soviet Union had long-standing relations with Afghanistan. The U.S. had literally pushed Afghanistan aside when it came to the British Empire leaving the region and leaving Pakistan basically as its ally after its formal creation, of which something like 3/5 of the lands used to create Pakistan were actually Afghan lands. So you had a clear indication, sphere of influence, and we just couldn't figure out how this happened so quickly. So that was the first sign that something wasn't right with the narrative that was coming out. And as it moved further into it, we began to see within days there were calls from people like Richard Pipes that they're going to go to basically be invaded in Europe pretty soon, and they want the oil fields to stop the oil from coming to the United States. So there was a lot of aggressiveness that seemed to project very quickly. So we just noted all these things, and when the Western media was basically kicked out 1 month after the invasion, and there was a blackout, we decided at that point, within a short period of time, we were going to try and get a visa to go in. We got the visa within 6 months, and that's how we ended up going in for CBS News, because the networks could not get in on their own. So that began our very, very intriguing education in the narrative creation process, starting with CBS, going on to ABC and PBS.
Great. And maybe you can elaborate on this narrative creation and how it was at odds with what you were observing or understanding about developments in the country.
Well, bringing that crew in there back in those days, today you can put your camera in your pocket and go through customs. Back in those days, you had to bring about $75,000, $100,000 worth of video equipment. Very expensive television cameras. Everything was analog. Nothing was digital. So, and then you had to find the right people who wouldn't, mess it up for you when you got in there. So that's what we put together. We put it together very quickly. CBS News was very aggressive about wanting the story. So we went in and they flew us to Kabul. We had permission to get in. Everyone else was coming in over the mountains if they could get in at all. And so at any rate, it was very unusual and we really didn't know what to expect. But, we talked to the Afghans at the United Nations, the PDPA's representatives there, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, that had taken over in 1978. And we told them, it was basically, it was a Hollywood pitch. I gave them a Hollywood pitch. I said, look, you're killing yourselves by keeping the Western media out. So, if you let me in, if you let us in, Liz and me, we'll just tell the story the way, you see it, and we'll see what the Afghans have to say, because that's the missing ingredient here. We're hearing what the Russians have to say. We're hearing what the Americans have to say. We don't know what the Afghans really want. So that's what we did. And they complied with that, and they understood it, and they accepted that proposal, and they fulfilled it. They let me go where I wanted to go and talk to who I wanted to talk to, and they presented their story. And I saw the education of women that was going on. I saw the way they were taking care of their children. I saw the fact that the Mujahideen, the illustrious freedom fighters, were coming down over the mountain, burning schools down, throwing acid in the faces of women, really repressive, all the kinds of things that for 100 years the Afghan government and the royal family had been working to overcome. So it was like, this is completely not Afghan, what they were doing. This was something else. And so, even Louis Dupree, the kind of American premier authority on Afghanistan, referred to what they represented, the guys up in the mountains, as backwoods Islam. That's the way he put it. He said it was their very unsophisticated understanding of what Islam was all about, not the highest form of Islam or higher forms of Islam. So at any rate, that's what the United States checked into. That was what it turned out, that the Brzezinski and the National Security Council had specifically invoked with their ethnicities program, the ethnicities working group, and they brought a bunch of people in there who were avowedly anti-communist, and they basically came up with whatever dirty trick they could pull on the Afghan government. So that's how it really began. It was just kind of, in fact, one of the CIA people, McMahon was the guy's name, said, there's no plan to this. He complained about it. He said, there's no plan to what you're doing. He said, unless you have a plan, it's all just fun and games. But that's what they felt they could do with Afghanistan. They could play their fun and games on the Afghans and get away with it. And lo and behold, that's what happened.
Well, there was actually a deep agenda, though, that we, of course, at the time didn't know for sure, that was to basically keep the Soviets tied down in Afghanistan. And the provocations coming over the border from Pakistan were very intentional. And the money that was pouring in was basically going to people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was a well-known drug lord and fiercely against the royal family for long before the Soviet invasion, and had actually was attacking Afghanistan from Pakistan before the Soviet invasion. So you have a lot of issues, but I think the point we would like to make, it was when we came back to New York and actually saw what CBS really wanted. That was the first high-level initiation into the manufacturing of the narrative and how they were able to take what we had brought back and turn it into their story, and the crafting of it at that point. So it was definitely not what we wanted to see, and we were, of course, and that's when we actually took our material and decided to create a documentary about it, which we then did with PBS. And although we did the documentary, we were able to produce with not too much interference from PBS, but what they did to make sure this basically pretty representation of our experience came through, they made sure nobody saw it. They made sure that it got as little airing as possible.
Oh, it aired.
So
They aired it in Boston.
Yeah,
It aired
but-
at midnight on a Saturday night in the middle of August. I mean, that
Yeah.
was it. Well, they conformed to it.
yeah, the fix was in.
And they told us, they said, yeah, we think this is the best. That's what they told us at WGBH. They said, this is the best presentation of on-hand journalism, first-person journalism we've seen about this issue. And, and so, well, why don't you put it on prime time? Well, we can't do that. We have to air Masterpiece Theater.
Right.
We're obligated to that.
Right.
So.
Right.
But, that which goes kind of to the whole root cause of what this is all about, and that's the British influence. And that's something that really just kind of leaves everybody behind. There's so many aspects of the story that just don't register with an American public, and it didn't register with the American government either. It was really left up to the specialists, the people who had, the Europeans in many cases, in terms of exactly what was going on. Afghanistan was a British issue. It had been for a couple of 100 years. The British had been very frustrated by the Russians in Afghanistan and by the Afghans, of course. The British had suffered their largest military defeat up to that time in Afghanistan. So that's where it got very interesting, because we weren't just talk to American politicians and American theorists. We had maybe one or two. Sig Harrison at what foundation? In Washington. He'd been a Washington Post reporter, actually, bureau chief. And he was at the Carnegie Endowment. And he was basically the only guy who actually understood it. He'd been there. He'd spoken to them. He'd come into Afghanistan and spoken to Adolph Dubs, the ambassador. He got the whole layout from him as to what he thought needed to be done with Afghanistan and how to maintain its independence and not do anything specifically to aggravate the Soviets so that they would want to invade or feel the need to invade. He was very sensitive to that. Dubs was. And so that's where we went with the story.
Yeah, so, well, we only have 10 minutes in this segment, and we want to discuss the Dubs case in some depth and Brzezinski and his design. So which one should you want to address first?
I was hoping that we could do some of the Brzezinski and the second part of the series.
All right, so why don't you talk a bit about Adolph Dubs and how his assassination set the groundwork for the war, disaster war that followed?
I just also wanted to ask if we could bring the Trilateral Commission to light and the impact that had, and Rockefeller. And, how did that play into this oil stuff and the drug trafficking? And,
okay, well, let's start with the Dubs case, and then we'll get into that.
Thanks.
Well, the issue, Adolph Dubs was a career Foreign Service officer. He had been in World War II. He was a Marine. He was a pretty tough guy and very smart. And he really believed that, that it was very important. He saw Afghanistan for what it was. I mean, Afghanistan, ironically, was labeled a third-rate or fourth-rate power by the, in terms of its importance by the State Department. And so what he did was he actually looked at it in terms of its influence in international relations and in terms of its history. And he basically, he could see that it was far more important than anyone else. And so did Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski had a much larger agenda at work going on. And so the two of them came head to head over Afghanistan.
Well, I'd like to just quickly mention that it turns out that it was in fact the creation of the Trilateral Commission with Rockefeller's money and Brzezinski starting it that actually set the stage for Jimmy Carter eventually becoming president. And the Trilateralists basically taking over most of the important functions in the Carter administration. So when you really go back and look at how Carter and Brzezinski operated, you can see an incredibly heavy hand of really setting up very intentionally the unfolding that eventually led to the Soviet invasion. But what most people don't realize is that you have to actually look at what happened before the assassination of Adolph Dubs 9 months earlier to really begin to understand how that final act of the Soviet invasion was a fait accompli that just simply, there was no prophecy there. And Carter's claim it was the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War was basically, obviously a catch-it-all against the Soviet line.
And Dubs was a barrack because he was trying to prevent that outcome of war, correct?
Exactly.
And they had to murder him to go forward with their grand scheme of bogging, the Soviet Empire with the ultimate goal, right? Just to use Afghanistan as a kind of pawn to draw the Soviets in, and I guess maybe to have a base ultimately in the wider Middle East. So yeah, explain how they had to kill Dubs and how they framed his death.
Well, okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to bring up, I think if you do want to go back a little bit to the creation of the Team B report, when Bush allowed for the an analysis of the intelligence for the Soviet Union, and what became Team B were the ones who basically felt that we couldn't work with them. They were outsiders, Paul Nitze and Leo Chern and Danny Graham. These are people who were well-known, Russophobes, well-known neocons. And they had a prophecy within the Team B report, which said at some point in the near future, and this would have been 1975, that the Soviet Union was going to cross the border into a neighboring country and prove their prophecy. They wanted to take over the world. So Brzezinski gets into office in January of 1977 and immediately begins to activate what would eventually lead to the prophecy coming true. So what Brzezinski was really able to do was fulfill the prophecy. And he was able to fulfill it to the point where I don't think many people today understand that the level of Russophobia that people are witnessing now was a direct result of what Brzezinski was able to do by literally infecting the entire bureaucracy with his Russophobia. Because once the Soviets crossed the border, they had a kind of casus belli that they were able to use every generation against the bureaucrats that were trying to push for any kind of negotiated this or that. And now, of course, we know there really is no such thing as negotiation. Well, you've got to go back to Brzezinski's, and he was the best known Russophobe of all. And that is why it's important to understand that the neocons and that Russophobic approach was not, it was present, but it was not total. And now we can see it became total.
So we put our documentary out, and we had a premiere of it before it got on the PBS system. We had a premiere at the Parker House in Boston, the famous Parker House. And so a number of people locally were invited, news media people, the New York Times people, correspondent for Boston, Boston Globe people. And so also a man by the name of Theodore Elliott was invited. Theodore Elliott had been the ambassador to Afghanistan. Wow. And he'd been there for a number of years, quite a long time. And so I don't know if you're familiar at all with the old Boston Brahmin type approach to U.S. foreign policy, but they were a dominant factor in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, as well as the 70s. And so at any rate, they're all about 7 feet tall. So at any rate, I presented the documentary, and I stood up in front of the screen after I started to answer questions. And Theodore Elliott started standing up and answering the questions that were addressed to me. Yeah. And so it was really quite amazing. So it happened 3 or 4 times. And so finally I said, look at Ambassador, I realized that, you probably have access to information that I didn't get when I was on the ground in Afghanistan. But, these people, on my view is the only one that I have. And, this is what I came here to present. And he looked at me and he said, you are treading very dangerously close to being a conduit for Soviet propaganda. Wow. Right on the spot. Okay. Now, coming from someone as high up as that, he bothered to come out in the first place. So, afterwards, right after that, a man rushed over. His name was Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project. And he said, Paul, you're exactly what I want the negotiation project to do. And he said, don't excuse what Ted said. I work with him all the time. He's really a good guy, and he's just kind of upset because it's personal for him. He spent so long in Afghanistan; it's a personal issue. So he said, if I can be of any help in the future, let me know. So at any rate, I kind of made peace with Ted Elliott that evening, and so the time came around a couple of years later, and the issue really wasn't going anywhere. So we proposed to go back again to Afghanistan and see what had happened in the 2 years we had been there. And we asked Roger, would you like to go with us? And he said, well, if they'll let me. So we appealed to the Afghans. We said, we want to bring this international negotiator, Roger Fisher, and to Afghanistan, and we'll do it. And so that was the beginning of the next deeper involvement we became with.
Well, that wraps up our show for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Kuzmarov. Remember to like, donate, and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
All right, that was very good. We got to do one more segment here. I'm just going to reset everything.
Okay.
And you're going to. Do you want to discuss what you want to talk about in this one before we go into it?
No, I think whatever we left off, we're going to hit up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. Yeah, what they're saying is interesting. Yeah, about this Russophobia and the lack of a anti-war movement or opposition movement in the country to the U.S.-Afghan policy. So that may be my first question.
Well, the other thing I'd like to stress, since we're going to talk about like our briefing, is that the patterns that we're seeing are the same patterns that are replicated in all color revolutions. All of a sudden, a switch goes on, and the media is flooded with the same message. And these are like fingerprints that once you see them, I saw this in Nicaragua myself. And once you see it, you see it all the time. You're just sensitive to this flooding of airwaves of a specific narrative. And that's one of the tells I think we could all agree on. So I'd like to kind of discuss how this is not unique to Afghanistan, but this is something that we've learned to observe, and we're always looking for it. And our audience should always look for these tells. So it's not surprised by something. Thank you.
All right, well, let's get started. Gloria, it's your show, so take it away.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, a former administrator in New York City government, an investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left, it's right on. I'm joined here today by a resident expert, Jayme Kuzmarov. Jayme is a professor at Tulsa Community College, a historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of Covert Action Magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. In today's two-part series, uncovering the truth about the CIA's jihadist holy war in Afghanistan, Jayme and I are joined here today by Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. They were the first American journalists to enter Afghanistan after the 1979 Soviet invasion. At the time, they were operating an on-ground as freelance TV news crews for CBS News. In 1982, they produced a PBS documentary, and in 1983, returned to Kabul for ABC's Nightline. They are the publishers of many books and articles on this topic, and I'm hoping that they, at some point, can give us this list and also let us know where we can find them and keep up to date with their important work. I think where we left off pretty much was they were just about discussing their trip back to Kabul for the ABC Nightline. So I hope we can start there. Also, Jayme had some questions. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just pick up on that. And I will say that So we asked Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project if he'd be interested, and he said, yeah, I would. I would really like to go and get some firsthand. Roger had done some backdoor negotiations for the hostage crisis, the Iranian hostage crisis, and so he was very up on it. He'd done a lot of international negotiating with the Russians. He knew them. So anyway, we get to Afghanistan, and Roger basically disappears. He just, it's like everyone's saying, where did Roger go? I don't know. So anyway, so he comes back 3 or 4 hours later. We're sitting down to dinner in Kabul at the Kabul Hotel. And so, Roger, where did you go? And so he said, I went over to the Soviet embassy. He said, guess what? The Russians don't want to be here. Now, this is the spring of 1983. CBS News is pushing an idea that the fact is that the Soviets are long-term in there. They want to conquer the Middle East, and they're using Afghanistan as a stepping stone.
In fact, CBS had done reports before we left for Afghanistan in May of 1983 for, I think, 3 nights in a row. And what they showed was Kabul was overrun with Soviet tanks and soldiers, and they were presenting it as proof that they really were in their own Vietnam. One of the shocks we got was when we landed in the airport, there was no presence of Soviet anything. So we didn't understand what had obviously happened. Something happened. Anyway, but that sets you up for, here we have this experience where not only do the Soviets want to get out, but, there is no Soviet presence. And as we went through this experience, talking to the Afghans and once again, similar to 1981.
And the American aid workers that were there.
Right.
And we went over, ironically, because of Roger's visit, he went and got the U.S. Embassy involved, which was something I didn't particularly want to do because I didn't want to upset our hosts about what was going on and have them consider me to be some kind of a threat to whatever they were doing. So at any rate, so Liz and I said, we'll go with you to there would be a once-a-week dinner that would go on at the embassy residence. So, I mean, it was really wonderful going to the American embassy in this dirt poor third world country and walking through the gates, and it looked like a Beverly Hills mansion, okay, with green grass and a swimming pool and everything. So we go in, and there's a number of people, all the expats are there, and the British are there it was Friday, the Sabbath dinner. So at any rate, so we're sitting there, we met this group of an NGO. I believe they were Quakers, weren't they? A Quaker organization. So I said, what do you think of this government? And he said, I think it's the best government Afghanistan's ever had.
Wow.
He said they admit that, and Roger had said this too, he said they admit that they made a lot of mistakes at the beginning. They didn't really know how to govern. They didn't know what they were doing. But the fact is that he said they're really doing everything they possibly can to lift the entire population up at the same time, simultaneously. So he said, and so we went and we actually did interviews with the foreign minister from Afghanistan, and we did interviews with the prime minister of Afghanistan, with Roger, and they all admitted that yes, they made mistakes, but they're correcting those mistakes. They just wanted to be accepted, to the community of nations, basically, and that they really didn't want the Russians to be there. The Afghan government didn't want the Russians to be there, and now we discovered the Russians didn't want to be there either. So this whole idea about the narrative being created around that event, it was completely outside of that. So where did this narrative come from? Who created this narrative?
Well, at that dinner, we did find out the answer to the question about all the Soviet soldiers who were riding around Kabul weeks before we got there that seemed to have disappeared. The Quakers that we were talking to, we ended up asking them. We saw this story by Dershmead from CBS, and it was, Soviets all over the place. And he said, Eric, we know who he is. He waited around for the troop rotation, and it was well known that the Soviets would send soldiers from the north to the south, and from the south going back to the Soviet Union to the north. There was literally,
and they all crossed over in Kabul.
Right. And so he literally took those images, and CBS presented them as proof that the entire country was overrun, and they were in their own
You know,
Vietnam.
Kabul, Afghanistan had one road that went from the south to the north, and the Soviets managed to get into a traffic jam when they got to Kabul. So, and that was what they were reporting. That was the real story. Was it was a traffic jam in Kabul. So, you know, so it bit by
But
bit.
that was not the headline.
Was not the headline.
Not only that, but when we returned for ABC Nightline, Roger was basically pretty much, set up with a Soviet dissident, okay, to basically be arguing against his position that it was worth trying to negotiate the Soviets out of Afghanistan. So they very much framed the Nightline to give the impression it wasn't worth trying.
It wasn't possible.
The Soviets don't want to leave. This is impossible. And so we, again, the same issue that we experienced with CBS, we experienced with ABC. And in fact, we ended up calling up the foreign editor for CBS who ran the story about the troop rotation being the Soviets were.
He actually wound up calling us.
All right. Well, we ended up asking him about the troop rotation because we knew now that it wasn't true. These guys absolutely have not. They're shameless. They don't care.
Yeah, he says
absolutely.
So I said. So he said, "Did you go?" And I said, "Yeah, we went for ABC Nightline." And he said, "I said, and by the way, I said that story you ran before we left about the troops and being overrun in just like Vietnam, just like Saigon." I said that was the annual troop rotation. So there was silence at the end of the phone when I told him. So we had found out the truth, but it didn't matter. It really didn't matter. The fact is that, I mean, it did matter. It mattered to the Afghan people. It mattered to the American people. But the fact is that in terms of the narrative, it didn't dent the shell at all. And that's when, after that was when Charlie Wilson began to really go active and really started to gin up Congress. He's saying, look, we got a real victory here. He's telling the rest of the Congress, left and right. He said, look, we got a victory here. We can win over Soviet communism, and this is the way to do it. And so this is what the Charlie Wilson's war began. And we later, at one of our events, when Invisible History came out from City Lights back in 2009, we did an event over at Harvard University, and we went in, and who's there, who's hosting it, but Charles Dunbar, who had been running the U.S. Embassy as the charge d'affaires when we were there in 1983. And he's got this other guy he's talking to standing there, and it's Chuck Cogan. Chuck Cogan was the guy who ran the operation for the CIA from 1985 to 1979 to 84. And so anyway, it's just like, oh my God, here we are. I already went up against Ed Elliott. Now we've got two of them to deal with, But at any rate, so the first thing, it was very interesting. It was the first thing that after we finished speaking, Liz delivered her pitch and I delivered mine. And Chuck Cogan was the first one up to the microphone. I went, oh my God, what's going to happen next? So anyway, so he said, he's a fellow at Harvard, right? So anyway, so he said, I agree with your position on what happened and why the Soviets went in. He said, it's really not an issue. He said, they didn't want to go in. We knew they didn't want to go in. And he said, but this idea that Brzezinski lured them in intentionally, he said, I just don't buy that. He said, I ran that operation for 5 years. And he said, that's just not the way the operation worked. And it's not the way the CIA works. We don't lure countries into doing things. So at any rate, that was great. That was 2009. So a number of years later, we decided that we really had to talk to Chuck Cogan some more because there were obviously things that he knew that we wanted to find out. So anyway, so Liz called him up and he said, oh, come over to my apartment. So I called up the guy that I'd taken, the cameraman that I'd taken to me with me to Afghanistan in 1981. And I said, I want this on camera. I want to film this. So at any rate, so we all trooped over to Chuck Cogan's house in Harvard Square and went in and he welcomed us. And I started throwing questions at him about what I had uncovered that was going on that, I thought that he might want to know about and that he may not have known about. At any rate, he said, can I tell you something? And I said, please tell me. So he said, well, I finally got to talk to Brzezinski. He said he came up here for Samuel Huntington's memorial service. I had never met him before personally. And he said, I told him, I said, I don't buy that stuff about you intentionally luring the Soviets into Afghanistan. And Brzezinski says to him, I did. It was all intentional. You didn't know what we were doing at the National Security Council, and we didn't want you to. So this was how we got Afghanistan. It was completely manufactured. It was Brzezinski. It was his ethnicities working group. It was Benigzi's British agenda for inciting the Muslim population of Soviet Central Asia, and that was completely left out of your approach. It was not talked about at all. Nobody, unless you were into the issue deeply the way we were, you wouldn't even bother to find out about it. So,
well, there is one story that I love to tell, when we get to this point in the Brzezinski story, especially with the Chuck Hogan's acknowledgement for the first time. And that would have been 2015, I believe, when he had that acknowledgement to us. Brzezinski wrote an article in 2016 that basically made it clear that whatever the winning of the Cold War was and the disillusionment of the Soviet Union that set us on this pattern with the total takeover by the neocon thinking and the Russophobia and the level of takeover that we now can really see today, and the complete walk away of any kind of negotiation. Well, in 2016, Brzezinski basically was making it clear that this was really not the right way to handle the gifts that he had given the United States, that the U.S. really has to understand that we have to basically change from being an imperial power, and I'm assuming he was referring to, we have to move to soft power rather than hard power. And we have to mature basically, in our leadership role. And he was talking a lot about how we have to befriend Russia, and we have to basically get China on our side, because Brzezinski had always understood if Russia and China get together, that's really a serious problem for the United States. And here he was in 2016 trying to make this recommendation that we know had already been passed, that it had already gone the other way, but yet you could see his effort, and I always felt that he ultimately died only about a year later, that he died really realizing he had a Pyrrhic victory, because he really believed what he had done was set up the U.S. to become a great world leader. He was witnessing, this is not what's happening in 2016. You're misusing the gifts I gave you. So I always found that to be very important.
Tragic irony.
Yeah. And that, that he lived long enough to see really the failure of what he'd done, not the success alone.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, related to Ukraine, well, don't you think that they're replicating a similar strategy of luring Russia into Ukraine? But you're saying Brzezinski realized that in this day and age that was a mistake now, because that was drawing Russia closer to China.
Yes, exactly.
Which is like, when you go back to Mackinder, you go back to the turn of the 20th century, and you look at this whole objective about needing to secure Eurasia for Western interests. That was the primary focus, and it's been the primary focus since the beginning of the 20th century. And it used to be, it was the land empire that the czars were creating with the railroads once the technology was up and running, and having access to that southern aspect of it, the Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, that area, that was looked upon, it was viewed upon by the future, by the futurists of the early 19th century, 20th century, as being something that really needed to be a focus. And so, and the British, of course, were already there. So it was an issue that in the transfer of power at the end of World War II from the British to the Americans, it's like, there are quotes from, you've got British secret agents who are going to Langley in the early 1950s, the late 1940s, and they're saying, this is the Raj. We've recreated the Raj, the British rule of India. So they really expected to be able to carry that agenda that early 19th century, late 19th century agenda into the 21st century. And unfortunately, they're just not well schooled enough to be able to make it work. And Brzezinski was warning them. Brzezinski knew full well that, that this is what he was doing. He and Pipes, there used to be a story. We ran into someone who was a scholar at one point, and he said, he said he was at Harvard in the 1950s when Brzezinski and Pipes were there. And he said they used to walk around campus talking in high Polish so that no one would understand what they were plotting. And so, ironically, Richard Pipes took over for Brzezinski as national security advisor. He was going to. They wanted him as national security advisor. They put him in charge of something else because he couldn't get past. But the fact is that they carried this ethnic program of infuriating the Muslim population of South Asia and against the Russian population in the north. So it really was. Paul Warnke referred to it as ethnic foreign policy. He said we've engaged in an ethnic foreign policy, and of course that had its upside in terms of their defeat in Afghanistan, but the downside was what we have today.
And I really like to add that the whole reputation of President Carter, I think when you really factor in this very important relationship and very active relationship he had with Zbigniew Brzezinski, during his administration, is totally understood. That's all because of the narrative that was created about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And Charlie Wilson's War being the major story through Hollywood is another indication that became the narrative. And most Americans to this day, if you ask most Americans about what happened, in the Soviet invasion time, they would say basically Charlie Wilson's War. That would be their understanding of it. And that, unfortunately, as we know, is the propaganda story that they told themselves.
Chuck Hogan had no use for Charlie Wilson's War either. He just said it's nonsense. He said, we're the ones that did the heavy lifting. So at any rate, it's interesting when you get inside the system, and that's just it about the system. When you've got somebody like Chuck Hogan or Graham Fuller or somebody like that, who are really the guys, they were the engineers making this sort of thing happen. You sit them down and you don't come at it from an ideological point of view. You just come at it and say, this is pretty interesting, and I saw this happen, and I was there, and there was just this phantom floating around the room. How did that happen? So you get to kind of concretize those events in a much more meaningful way, and that's what Liz and I brought to this. We didn't come from an ideological perspective. We came from a perspective of this was not really good for the United States. It's not good for humanity that we keep this nuclear arms race going. So what do we do? What's the best solution to working this thing out? And so that's what we came up with. And
I think it's chilling when we learn that our government is not acting in our best interest as its constituency, that our government is acting exclusively for the benefit of certain corporations and certain families in particular industries. And, we see time and time again in all of these things, not only Jayme talks a lot about the geopolitical advantages of, Afghanistan or Syria, things like that. I also, from more of an economic standpoint, look at the bread and butter things. What are they getting out of it and who's getting it? And in the case of Afghanistan, they had a very big heroin trade, which actually was clamped down on and then restarted when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. I mean, I have photos of American soldiers guarding poppy fields. And that, a lot of people don't realize what we were doing in Afghanistan. We were protecting not only the oil fields for U.S. interests, for Mobil, Exxon, for the Rockefeller family and BlackRock and things like that, but we were also protecting the poppy fields and the heroin trade. So, I mean, there's all of these, special products that, we get when we do these things. And, you look at Ukraine, what's going on, who's winning. And actually, Jayme had a quote in his article that I really liked, and it was in regard to Dubs killing. And the U.S. was saying, "Oh, he was killed by the Soviets." Everyone was pointing at everyone else, but it's also true in general. And Jayme referred to the Roman philosopher Seneca, and I hope I'm saying that right, once stated that the one who derives advantage from a crime is the one most likely to have committed. And in the case of Dub's killing, the main beneficiaries were not the Soviets, but the neoconservatives within the United States and Europe and CIA, who wanted to avenge the American defeat in Vietnam by drawing the Soviets into a quagmire in Afghanistan. And I also believe the oil was very important and the heroin trade. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's true. I mean, when we asked Chuck Hogan, they said, they had a very progressive government in Afghanistan. You really could have worked with them instead of overthrowing them, instead of sicking these medieval characters on them. You really could have worked with them. And he said, no, we had to use it to get even with the Russians for Vietnam. Right. That was the prime motive. And if you read Robert Gates's books, former Secretary of Defense and in CIA, he says the same thing. He said they were bouncing, where they were going to put their Russia's Vietnam around at the CIA for a number of years. And they finally settled on Afghanistan. In fact, one of them actually asked the question in his book. He says, should that be what should Afghanistan be Russia's Vietnam? And the CIA decided, yes, it should. So.
Yeah. Well, you have to really, Americans obviously have to take in and understand, why is it that Wild Bill Donovan in the creation of OSS called his original agents Knights Templars?
Right.
Okay? And why is it that we have people today who are justifying to this day the assassination of JFK based on the execution of Jacques de Molay in 1314 by the Catholic Church? So we've got a lot of issues coming out of the intelligence world that Americans have bits and pieces, and either no interest or bits and pieces, or a lot of wild stuff is put out, I think, to basically destroy the real evidence and the real patterns that you need to study to understand the reality of the fact that right now the intelligence communities are still, in many cases, carrying the baggage of the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, the Knights of Malta, the Masons. All of these things are very real. So that's what we really have come to understand, partly because we've done a lot of deep research into the Fitzgerald legacy, due to Paul's relationship to the Fitzgerald legacy. So we have a profoundly deep understanding of the true history that does go back 1,000 years, that is wrapped up, at the highest level with the motion of history, and did in fact directly connect to the assassination of JFK.
I just want to point out to our audience that the F in John F. Kennedy is for Fitzgerald. Some of our audience may be a little younger than others. Thank you.
Right.
Well, yeah, I have two questions, and related to what you're saying is very interesting. The first question I just wanted to add: it seemed like there's a total implosion of the anti-war movement and kind of dissenting spirit in America after Vietnam. I mean, Americans had been lied to, and you had this huge anti-war movement. And here you come out with this cutting-edge documentary to debunk the narrative about Afghanistan, and that's what a lot of anti-war writers were doing about Vietnam. So why didn't they take to your documentary and people criticize? Because there was very limited criticism of this Machiavellian strategy that basically sacrificed the Afghan population. So I wanted to just ask you about that, your feeling about that. And we're still left on left. I mean, the left today is similarly out to lunch. They don't probe the narrative about Ukraine enough. They don't question the Russophobia like on other issues. So I just wanted to ask you about that. And then if we have time, maybe you can address this kind of messianic fervor that seems to drive some of these imperialistic...
Jayme, unfortunately, we got the notice, the wrap it up notice. So I just like to use
maybe
the last.
They can briefly
the
address
last.
That.
No, we can't. But or we're going to torture poor CheeseSlice with incredible editing. But what I just like to give a chance to is for our lovely guests, Paul and Elizabeth, to give just where we can find your work, where our audience can find your work, Please just say that real quick, and then we'll be wrapping the show up. Thank you.
Well, we have a website called Valediction. This is actually the book we're talking about. The Valediction is the memoir, and we have part 2 also, and it's valediction.net, which is where you can find a lot of information. We also do monthly roundtables where we're probing continuously this deep history into the Fitzgerald legacy, which we feel is directly connected to understanding so much of the disconnects that seem to be on the surface of these stories. Thank you. That's it.
Well, that wraps up our show for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like, donate, and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
All right.
That was phenomenal. You guys got to come back again and again and again.
Yeah.
This is amazing.
Like, if you guys would like to answer Jeremy's question, we can go ahead.
Yeah, I actually, with this actually goes
Well,
back.
real quick, I'd also like to plug your book if you still are interested in that, The Invisible History.
Well, we have, see, we've got the Afghanistan. We've got, well, this is the Afghanistan. And
That's
then,
our academic side.
academic side, right? And then we have the book 1 and book 2, and we're working on book 3 to put it all together. This is the memoir, which is really the walk through the narrative creation process that forced us out of direct journalism the way we've been doing it, because we really confronted a very real truth. We said, if the facts don't matter to the mainstream narrative, what does? How, you can't make easy sense out of that. So that's what we started probing, and that led us into a whole other way of interpreting everything. And that's part of what our memoirs
As I said,
about.
during the interview, I said, we both come from very different backgrounds, and I was at BU in 1969, the fall of 1969, and there were protests everywhere. The left was everywhere, SDS. Before I even went, when I was in high school, the one question that the faculty advisor said to me, the guidance counselor said to me in spring of 1969 is that BU has the largest population of SDS, Students for Democratic Society, of any university in the United States. What are they going to do when they ask, what are you going to do when they ask you to join? So at any rate, I got to BU and I was interested in running on the track team and basically, staying ahead of being a freshman in the English department. And so the very last day of that semester, I read in the Boston Globe they were holding auditions, open auditions for the musical Hair. The New York musical was coming to Boston, coming to the Wilbur Theater. So I said, wouldn't it be a lark to just go in and audition for Hair? Wouldn't that be something, right?
Long and short.
Long and short was I went and did that evening. I got a note in my mailbox. I had to go meet my faculty advisor. My faculty advisor says to me, he said, have you ever considered working for your government? We've been looking at what you've been writing for the last 3 months, and we found it very interesting. So I went, oh, no. Well, I actually signed up to do an audition for this musical called Hair. So he said, oh, well, he said, think about it. You have far more serious things to do in your life, right? So at any rate, I did the audition 10 days later, and they gave me the lead in the show Hair. I got to play Claude for a year.
I got to see photos. You guys.
Oh no, we have something better. We have Paul singing a number of benefit performance. It's online. It's actually from 1970. It turned out that it had been filmed by someone, part of it. And so, I mean, you could see him when he had hair.
Oh yeah.
No, so Claude was a sexy character in Hair. Yeah, I want to see this photo.
Oh yeah.
So that's me.
That's him.
That's me.
Well, we actually have the YouTube is Paul Fitzgerald benefit performance, Boston City Hospital,
right?
1970.
1970.
That was the YouTube. We got the footage. It was actually magically delivered to us in 10 years after the event.
A couple of years later, I get called, and I get called from New York, and Jesus Christ Superstar is open, and they're looking for replacements. So I went down and auditioned, and they made me Jesus. So, I like to say, I may not be the Messiah, but I have played him on the stage.
But there's one point. Now, there's a serious point I do want to make to address your question, Gloria, and yours, Jeremy, about the peace movement. What we all got involved with in 1960s, our generation, especially boomers, was the anti-Vietnam War movement, which we felt very proud. All of us believed that we really had ended the war. At that time, I don't know if I realized what ending the draft meant. I didn't know. I don't think I really understood it meant creating effectively a mercenary American army. I didn't realize that was going to be the outcome. But what we really didn't know until we did a kind of deep dive into it was how totally controlled the peace movement was, and how totally rigged it was, and how it was intentionally undermined. So you know what part of the undermining was? They made the association between hippy-dippy, acid-driven, crazy people are for peace. Serious people aren't. That was an intentional, complete, kind of, they forced that together. And so that's part of what we're determined to do now, is to really raise people's attention to the fact that, especially, our generation, we were the ones that really thought we did it, and it was robbed from us. So we have to bring it back. Our generation.
We have to bring the spirit of that.
Yeah, the spirit of it back.
And that feeling. I mean,
Exactly.
we had guys who'd been in Vietnam, who just got off the streets of Vietnam, and they basically, one guy brought his medals up. He'd been decorated.
Yeah.
And, and we put him on the stage. This was 1970, and the feeling that you'd get from the people, the standing ovations we'd get, and just the outpouring of emotion over what was really happening and to their families. I mean, you'd open the Boston Globe and it would be page after page of black box on the obituary section, and that was a Vietnam veteran, killed in action.
Yeah.
So it was, and everybody, of course, had this draft card in their pocket, which was basically you're on
any minute.
They can call you at any minute, and so that it was really it was vibrant and real. And so that's when Liz said it was stolen. It was stolen because there really was a national feeling against violence and against doing any more of this stuff.
So, I think the main thing
I've got to run because I have another meeting. So. Thank you very much, Paul and Elizabeth. That was a really great discussion, and great to have you guys. And let's keep in touch.
Oh, yeah. Yes, please.
Well, I will send you the little research article we did on the music scene, including Laurel Canyon and all that.
Oh, wow. That's
the cultural.
That's what I'm going to talk about.
We realized what had undermined us.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think that needs to be brought out more. How that movement was undermined and co-opted, and then by the '80s it was useless when it was needed.
Yeah, right.
Well, we talk a lot.
I got to run, so because I have another meeting, but we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Well,
Thanks, guys.
Jeremy and I talk a lot about controlled opposition, and the peace movement was definitely infiltrated and controlled. And they enhance their elements, and then they suppress the most functional elements. And one thing that I came across when I was looking into another narrative, which was the trans activist narrative, was I came up with the origins of Tavistock and social engineering and the music scene from the British invasion, and how
absolutely,
the CIA, and how that was, it broke my heart because like you guys, I had a rock band, and I loved rock music, and I loved the whole concept. So I've uncovered so many of these CIA psyops throughout the years, but that one really hit home. I was like, oh my God, everything I've been singing and thinking.
Yeah, I know.
I've been so engineered.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's what I got introduced to when I went into hair, and I realized there was this whole other group of people who were behind the scenes making this thing happen. And then I get called down to New York and do Superstar, and that was Stigwood's operation. And one of the guys that hired me was Peter Brown. Peter Brown had been Brian Epstein's assistant when running the Beatles. So we'd have, and New York is New York, right? I mean, backstage, you'd get, what's his name? The head of Cream, what's his name? The guitar player was
Eric Clapton.
Clapton? Ginger Baker.
Yeah. Eric Clapton would show up backstage, and he was dating the lead woman there in the show, and And so there was just there was a lot of interaction in terms of what was going on, and I had to negotiate my contract with Peter Brown. Okay,
Wow.
so it's like, so I got, it's like, what is this? What is this group? What are they doing? Why are they here? And you had you had the British Mafia, and they referred to themselves as the Velvet Mafia. And so it was like, well, what exactly is this? So it took me years to figure out what exactly was going on. But anyway.
I had done some writing on the Catholic Church under a pseudonym, and I really uncovered just amazing stuff. So, yeah, the Knights of Templar and the Knights of Malta, that's all real. I mean, Wild Bill Donovan was a member of all of them. The Catholic Church, the CIA or the OSS, the mob, were all in cahoots, and the Vatican Bank was considered by Moneyval, which is like a regulatory oversight in Europe, considered the Vatican Bank one of the biggest money laundering organizations and operations that exists. So I thought that was pretty amazing. And you really saw them interact with murdering priests, and murdering priests, of course, but also murdering a pope. I don't know if you remember that one, where they.
I think I want to send you a copy. We actually ended up being invited to give a presentation at a Dallas convention on the JFK assassination for the 60th anniversary, where we were trying to help people understand about pulling back 1,000 years to look at this history and understand how this actual past history has a lot to do for a lot of people, not everybody. I'm not saying every single person that might have had a motive necessarily was in at this level, but it is literally kept out of the conversation. Okay, the association, you don't want. In fact, you'll have to listen to a story about a guy named Robert Moss. I don't know if he's a familiar name to you.
No.
But high level intelligence operative, Australian, who worked for the MI6 and with the CIA, very involved with Brzezinski and helping to create the phony narrative, right? Okay, associated, they say, with assassinations and all that. In 1987, Robert Moss suddenly starts working on becoming a dream guru. If you look him up right now online, you will see nothing at all in his wiki page or on his website, okay, which invites people to, he's a dream coach who's done Esalen in all of the top world places, that he was a very high level operative who obviously knows how to use the power of dreams. In fact, there was an article last week, about the fact that many people are beginning to realize they're being advertised directly in their dreams. And it's troubling, needless to say. Where is this coming from? How is it happening? So we have, and here you see a guy like Robert Moss, not a word on any of his dream stuff, that he is actually probably, you talk about Tavistock and you talk about MK Ultra. This is a guy who's using the tactics. Okay, Inception, the film with Leonardo DiCaprio, about using the power of the dreams to basically control people who to get them to do what you want. So this is all really has already happened. I don't even think it's a question of that. And that's part of what we've been kind of onto is this mystical power, which is really what dream power is. There's a reason that Cecil Rhodes was dubbed a mystical imperialist. Okay, that it wasn't just he was an imperialist. It was the mystical that made him this powerful imperialist. And people don't understand. Well, what we're now getting is the oozing out of how they want to use it. They want to directly advertise.
What's happening is that the technology and the old mysticism is kind of merging, and you've got. I think that's what happened. That's what's happening with the trans issue. I think we have a lot of stuff that's going on up here at the MIT Media Lab, and they're looking at medical solutions. One of the reasons for the degrading of the medical situation, the hospitals and healthcare and all that sort of thing is that there is this thing happening once again. a group inside the insiders is proposing this way of through things like mRNA to modernize your DNA, restructure your DNA through synthetic biology, and recreate you in the ideal of what Plato put out.
Yeah.
Millennia ago. It sounds crazy, but the fact is, they're doing it,
yeah.
Right? And they have the money and the technology to do it.
Yeah.
I just want to say how I know this lovely couple. It's really funny. We're members of something called the Truth Group, and it's run by I forgot Dr. Laura's last name. Do you recall her last name, Dr. Laura?
No.
Anyway, it's run by a physician, and it's on all different topics. And I had posted one of Jayme and mine and CheeseSlice's shows, which was on Carter, and you guys wrote back to me and said, "Oh, wait, we know Jayme. We did an interview with him. He wrote an article with us."
Oh, right. Yeah. Oh, I
know. It was on the Truth Group. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was Kapasa.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we get your emails because of Alana.
Okay. Then it was Kapasa that we know each other from, not Dr. Lori. I get them mixed up because a lot of the people in one are in the other. And I have to say, these small, intimate groups are fantastic because we're able to share so much information and connect. And it's you don't have to go through a zillion, articles and stuff to get to the truth. And people do find each other. It's really quite lovely. And and anyone who's in any of those groups is pretty much up to date on multiple issues, not just one issue. Like some groups are just this is it, but CASA and the Truth Group and a few other ones are really a very wide swath of issues that really affect our lives.
Right.
And the lives for our children and grandchildren and are really critically important. And, we also have our group, which is Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement. And I think I've added everybody to that. And that's where we have a discussion group once a week, usually on Thursday nights. And we pick, ongoing topics that we're all interested in. And then sometimes we have experts come in and talk to us. And other times we just are all experts in different areas and we bring our knowledge base to the table. So this is the way we fight back, and
I've got a question for you guys. Do you have a presence on something like TikTok or even Red Note now? Because the stuff that you're talking about is really fascinating, and you're telling stories that Americans of my generation, I'm Gen X, and I didn't even hear about your stories because they were shuffled to late night TV and stuff like that. But I know the younger generations, the millennials and the kids younger than them are would be fascinated to hear the stuff you're saying.
I know. We need one of those younger people to basically help us get on. It's way over my technical pace. I can't. I tried to do TikTok and I got scared because I made so many mistakes, and I know it can go out there. I actually put something out that I didn't mean to put out, and I was, no.
It was good though.
Anyway,
well, I think younger generations would take to what you have to say because it's fascinating, especially the connections of how we kind of basically destroyed Afghanistan. It led to 40 years of just a nightmare in that country.
Well, we had actually one of the things that we noticed about the Afghanistan thing. I mean, we worked with Afghans going back to obviously meeting. The first one was the chargé at the United Nations. At the beginning of our process in 1981, and continued to have friends. And one of them in particular was a woman named Seema Wali, who was actually the first Afghan refugee to come to this country in 1978. And she was actually hosted by Theodore Elliott, no less. So they're talk about a synchronicity, with him and him coming to our event on Afghanistan. But she ended up being really important Afghan. She wrote the introduction to our book, Invisible History. And she had an agency called Refugee Women in Development. So she was respected around the world for her work. And she was trying so hard to almost single-handedly save Afghanistan. When we originally met her, which would have been 1998, I believe, the first question she asked us, she said, it's been 10 years since the Soviets left. Why is it getting worse? And we had to sit her down and say, because they're not intending to save your country. You have to understand the truth about what happened and why. It isn't coming back. Okay, but you can try, you can do what you can to help the people, and we still know Afghans who are doing that under the most horrific circumstances, and the disheartenment of knowing what this country was and seeing what they did to it. It's just mind-boggling. But this is part of. So anyway, the thing that really was fascinating, I mentioned that Brzezinski ended up dying in May of 2017, and Seema ultimately came down with a terribly horrible something.
Neurological.
We really think she was poisoned in Afghanistan on one of her trips. Anyway, so she eventually ended up very ill and eventually died. And it turned out she lived in Falls Church, Virginia. And it turned out that she ended up dying in September of the same year. They both ended up dying in the same city, which we found. Yeah. And all we could think was, I wonder if these two spirits found each other. Here you have the man who is most responsible for that country being than any other individual in the whole world at that moment. Okay? Zbigniew Brzezinski, right? Seema Ali, who we believe represented the essence of the Afghan people. Unlike a lot of countries, they like this Homeh Zalizad. It was definitely not the kind of Afghan that cared about the people. Let's put it that. You have, Afghans who were sucked into the globalist Western, viewpoint and no longer really cared about the people. She was the one who cared about the people. And I just couldn't help but think, how ironic that was. And here we just mentioned, he actually died, we believe, saddened in some way that his wonderful gift to the United States did not produce the wonderful blooming of this new, experience for America, and that he really met his match in Seema spiritually at that moment.
But I think that's all really, really important. The one thing that's kind of left out in all of this is, again, the Trilateral Commission and who organized that and who was Brzezinski's godfather.
Oh, that was Rockefeller.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Rockefeller and Brzezinski were like that. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I took you seriously. I'm known for being that way.
You know the story. So,
yeah.
It's just,
Rockefeller,
we just go back a little bit further than you do.
Yeah.
Paul and Elizabeth, this has been fascinating, and I hate to cut it off, but I do have a heart out. I have to.
Okay.
I have another show starting in about 5 minutes.
Yeah. We should stay in touch then.
Please,
okay?
yeah, we'll send you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I really think that you have a message, you have stories to tell that would reach the younger generations, and I think they would really respond to it. So if you could have anybody that you could work with to help you get on to Red Note or TikTok, just do short 5-8 minute videos. Man, they would be pretty popular with the younger crowd. And if you can figure it out, I suggest it.
One of the things that CheeseSlice is working on for us is he's trying to hook us up with podcasts. So we're trying to get more of a handle on this stuff too. So we can certainly share information and help each other, and we would always love to have you two as guests. I mean, you guys are just an encyclopedia of knowledge and history, and everything that you're saying is predictive. It can be extrapolated to what's going on today and what will go on tomorrow.
Yeah.
So
very much so.
Urgent.
And when you bring in the JFK connection too, I think because we actually are the roundtables that we're a part of, which we've been doing with our publisher Chris Milligan since Valediction was first published. The first one was published in 2021, and so we have evolved an idea about how to bring back the peace that was stolen from us through JFK's intent. If you read his speech from American University, which was an embodiment of a solution for the world, and when you look at his whole history, going back to when he was a congressman, it actually really clearly showed that after World War II, he I like to describe him. He changed from being a warrior of war to a warrior of peace. And that's what eventually, obviously, took him down. But we think that the best way to deal with that is to resurrect what he was trying to do for us. So that's what our roundtables are dedicated to evolving. And we're working on an economic side of it too. I don't know if either of you have any familiarity with Henry George and the Georgist economic movement, but
Yeah.
familiar? Yeah, very few people. It was kept out of economics because Henry George was one of the most popular writers in the 19th century at the end of the 19th, with his solutions. Progress and Poverty was a very famous book. And it was literally Rockefeller created the School of Economics out of the University of Chicago, and they've created neoliberalism to kill Georgia, to suppress Georgist economics. Right now, Georgist economics is never mentioned. Okay, when you study economics, you have to find it on your own. And one of the reasons is even Lenin said Georgist economics could actually save capitalism for real. And apparently, they didn't want to save capitalism. They actually created, the whole idea of what became known as communism and socialism was totally manufactured to serve that purpose of the dialectic. Okay, Georgist economics completely undermines that purpose. Anyway,
Thank you. Thank you. We have to talk.
This is fascinating. Okay. And I work with someone else that I might throw a picture name to them and see if they want to hit you up and bring them on their show.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you all. Thank you,
all
Gloria.
Right. We'll
Thank you, Jayme.
Thank you.
Well, right before we get out of here, I want to plug your website and your books one more time. So, The Valediction is your website, thevalediction.net, and you got your books here. You've got Three Nights of Desmond.
And then over on this side, on this column on the right, we mentioned Invisible History, and the other books are mentioned there. So they're all present. Yeah,
so they're all here on. This is the shop page. So
right. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
All the links are to them on the website here. You've got 5 different books listed, and you've got 2 in this Valediction series, and book 3 is coming out in the next year or so.
Hopefully,
it's materialized.
Well, the fulfillment. No, that's why it's called Revelation. It has to really be revelation.
We're in Revelation right now.
Yeah,
that's
right.
what we're trying to interpret that.
All right, you guys. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll keep in touch.
Bye-bye.
All right, and everybody watching at home, I hope you had a good time. You can follow me over to my next show on Truthwire with Pasa and Fiorella, where they're going to be talking about current events, the helicopter, RFK, and Tulsi. So you can check us out over there. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week.